This is part 7 of our commentary on the readings for Lesson 8, Week 8, in our course, Reason in the Theology of St. Thomas. We just have a few more readings here to talk about. Much of the material in these readings from the Summa Theologia, questions 1, articles 1 through 3, Article 5 and 8 from question 1, as well as question 12, articles 12 through 13. Many of the material simply overlaps with and reiterates what's in the readings that we did in the Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 1, chapters 1 through 9. So there's not, I don't mean to comment again on those ideas. They're expressed slightly differently, but only accidentally differently in these texts. But what's interesting to compare what St. Thomas is doing in the Summa Contra Gentiles and the Summa Theologia, one thing that's interesting is to inquire about the mode of discourse that St. Thomas is using in each. St. Thomas says explicitly in the Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 1, that that book and the next two books, Books 1 through 3, are going to proceed in the order of natural reason, using only naturally known first principles and their conclusions, not employing or relying upon the doctrines of faith, where Book 4 does. St. Thomas's Summa Theologia, on the other hand, is altogether a theological work, written in theological mode. Although, of course, there's a multitude of philosophical material in the text, but it's not, strictly speaking, philosophical because it's always ordered towards the theological end of the treatise and fleshing out the development of what he calls the sacred science, which he says, in these articles we're going to treat, does proceed from the knowledge that we gain from faith, which is God's revelation of himself to us. Okay, so it's the Summa Theologia. Again, it's a specifically theological work with much philosophical material employed, and within it, one can read the Summa Theologia as a philosopher and find much to be enriched by and inquire about and puzzle about sometimes. But St. Thomas was a theologian, and there wasn't really yet a distinction here between, the professional philosopher and the professional theologian. That comes later on in the history of philosophy, with the professionalization of academics moving away from the church, and then you get a sort of philosophical discipline, post-Christian, that is. There were philosophers, of course, before Christ, but even they were not philosophers in the sense that they were limited in what they treated. They tried to know everything according to every mode, and it was a way of life, much more like a religious contemplative and a monk than a professional academic. So, Pierre Hadot's work on that is very, very rich. Philosophy as a way of life. Okay, well, let's look at some of the articles here, some of the material that might be interesting to compare with the Summa Contra Gentiles. So we have question 1 in his treatise on sacred doctrine, the nature and extent of sacred doctrine. We looked at articles 1 through 3. Article 1 is whether, besides philosophy, any further doctrine is required. Again, it's interesting to consider the epistemological situation of this question. Is this something that could be inquired about definitively and known through natural reason alone? Namely, that there's something more than natural reason. In other words, can the philosopher qua philosopher know that there's a higher science than his and defer to it? And, well, it seems to me no. It seems to me that the reason why St. Thomas could ask and answer this question so definitively is because he is a man of faith who has experienced and believes in revelation. And it's revelation that teaches that there's a higher science than philosophy. But that can be debated and has been debated. Something in the discussion box, perhaps, you might wonder ask and try to answer. But the answer St. Thomas gives here is the authority, of course, comes from Scripture. All Scripture inspired of God is profitable to teach, to reprove, to correct. Now, Scripture is no part of philosophical science, therefore it's useful that there's more. In other words, Scripture itself claims that there's more than philosophical science simply by its very existence, and its Scripture's claim to be revealed. So you might say that that's begging the question. It is, if you're trying to treat this issue strictly philosophically, that is begging the question. But of course, the audience for this text is not the same as the audience in the Summa Contra Gentiles, those who disagree with the truths of the Christian faith, the truths of the Jewish faith, pagans and Mohammedans mostly. This is the audience are young, budding theologians. This is a instruction manual in theology for beginners, St. Thomas says, actually. Incipientium, I think is the word he uses in the first preface to the question 1. No, actually in the prologue. Eruditionem incipientium, translated as the instruction for beginners, which is kind of funny that this is a beginner's work. Okay, and if St. Thomas now embellishes a bit on that authority in the Respondio, and he says that, and this is where you get the overlap with the Summa Contra Gentiles, man is directed to God as to an end that surpasses the grasp of his reason. Again, do we know, based on natural reason alone, that man is directed to God in a way more than his nature can accomplish and more than his reason can know? Is that something that reason knows or faith teaches us? Well, again, I'd like to see you discuss that in the discussion box. And if we're going to have an end that surpasses our reason, it has to be known in some way, and that's what divine revelation gives. Okay. Article 2, whether sacred doctrine is a science. Well, science, I think, for St. Thomas is simply a systematic, structured inquiry which results in demonstrated conclusions, knowledge, in some sense. So science doesn't have to be, strictly speaking, based on naturally known truths. There can be a science of faith as long as it's worked out in, using one's reasons. But the starting points don't have to be necessarily something that the senses tell us or natural human reason knows, and that's what St. Thomas says here. Sacred doctrine is a science because it proceeds from principles established by the light of a higher science, namely the science of God and the blessed. Sacred science is established on principles revealed by God, revelata sibi ad Deo. And you might think that for that reason, that it's not as certain as the human sciences, but in a later article, St. Thomas says, actually, that it is the most certain of sciences. Natural reason is fallible, divine reason is not. Through faith, we participate in the divine reason, even though it's partial and we're sinful still, but in a sense, insofar as we're participating in that divine science through the infused virtue of faith, we are absolutely certain with the certitude God has about his own self and his own things he's revealed. We have that kind of certainty about the first principles of the divine science, sacred science. Okay, part 8 coming up.